The massive metal corridors of New Centauri Station stretched in every direction like the inside of a giant machine. Thousands of beings moved through the halls each day, but they did not move together. Each species kept to their own kind, and everyone knew exactly where they belonged in the great chain of power that ruled the galaxy. At the very top were the Hegemony Alliance members. These were the species that controlled the biggest armies and the most advanced weapons. They walked, with their heads high, and expected everyone else to step aside when they passed. Below them came the trade species, the ones who controlled money and resources across many worlds. Then came the worker species, the ones who built things and fixed things and kept the stations running, and at the very bottom, barely above the slave races, were the humans and the broken people like the Kepler INS. Zara moved slowly through the lower maintenance tunnels, her blue skin glowing softly in the dim light. She was small, even for a Keplerian, and the heavy cleaning equipment she carried looked too big for her thin arms. Her people had once been artists and poets, filling their crystal cities with beautiful songs and glowing sculptures. But that was before the hegemony found their world and decided it had valuable minerals underneath all that art. Now Keplerians cleaned toilets and disposed of toxic waste on stations across the galaxy. Most beings barely noticed them, except when they wanted someone to kick. Zara knew the daily routine well. She would clean the waste systems in the morning, then sort garbage in the afternoon, then scrub the floors that others had walked on with their dirty boots. She had been doing this for 3 years now, ever since she was old enough to work. She could not remember the last time someone had spoken to her with kindness. Today started like any other day. She wheeled her cleaning cart down corridor C7, keeping her eyes down as groups of different aliens passed by. A cluster of Vorthak soldiers stomped past, their reptilian faces twisted in permanent scowls. Their boots made wet slapping sounds on the metal floor, and green saliva dripped from their mouths as they talked in their harsh, clicking language. One of them noticed Zara and said something to his friends. They all turned to look at her and started laughing. The sound was like rocks grinding together. Without warning, one of them spat a glob of acidic saliva that landed just inches from her feet. The metal floor hissed and started to smoke where the spit hit. Zara kept walking. She had learned long ago that stopping or looking upset only made things worse. The Vorthak laughed harder and moved on, already forgetting about her. Further down the corridor, a group of Chitauri were gathered around a food vendor. These insect-like beings were merchants, higher up the chain than Keplerians, but still below the real power holders. When they saw Zara approaching, they started clicking their mandibles together in a rhythm that sounded almost like mocking laughter. One of them deliberately stepped into her path, forcing her to walk around him. As she did, he made a loud buzzing sound that made the others click even faster. Even the peaceful Etherians, tall and graceful beings who claimed to value wisdom above all else, turned their backs when she passed. They would not hurt her directly, but they would not help her either. In their floating robes and glowing halos, they simply pretended she did not exist. This was life on New Centauri Station. Everyone had someone to look down on, and everyone had someone above them to fear. It was a system that had worked for thousands of years across hundreds of worlds. It kept order, the leader said. It prevented chaos. Jake Martinez had been on the station for only 2 weeks, but he had seen enough to make his stomach turn. He was human, which meant he was near the bottom of the social ladder, but he had not grown up in this system like most humans in space. He came from Earth, where people still believed in crazy ideas like treating everyone fairly. Jake worked in the maintenance section, fixing air recyclers and cleaning water filters. It was not glamorous work, but it was important. Without people like him, the station would stop working in a few days. Yet the higher species treated maintenance workers like they were barely worth the air they breathed. He was checking a ventilation unit. When he first saw Zara, she was trying to move a broken cleaning robot that was twice her size, struggling to push it toward the repair bay. Her thin arms shook with effort, and the blue glow of her skin had dimmed with exhaustion. Jake started to move toward her, but his supervisor, Pete Johnson, grabbed his arm. "Don't even think about it," Pete said, quietly, He was an older human who had been on various stations for 20 years. His face was lined with worry and his hair had gone gray from stress. "That's not our problem. She needs help," Jake said, watching as Zara nearly fell over trying to lift one end of the robot. "She's not human," Pete replied. "We help our own. And only our own. That's how we survive out here. You start mixing in other species' problems, and before you know it, you're the one getting blamed for everything that goes wrong." Jake watched as Zara finally managed to get the robot moving again, inch by painful inch. She did not ask for help. She probably knew no one would give it. "That's messed up," Jake muttered. Pete's expression grew serious. "Listen, kid. I know. You're new, and maybe things were different on Earth, but out here, humans are barely tolerated. We're seen as weak, primitive, and generally useless. The only reason they keep us around is because we're good at fixing things and we work cheap. You start causing trouble, and they'll find an excuse to kick every human off this station. Is that what you want?" Jake did not answer, but he kept watching Zara as she disappeared around the corner. Over the next few days, Jake began to notice things he had missed before. He saw how other species would deliberately bump into Keplerians in the hallways. He watched as Vorthic youngsters would throw garbage at them and laugh when they flinched. He noticed how the food vendors would serve Keplerians last, if at all, and how they were charged double for everything, but it was not just Keplerians. The system was designed to let everyone punch down at someone. The Chitauri merchants would cheat the worker species. The worker species would abuse the service species. And everyone, absolutely everyone, felt free to treat humans and the other. Primitive races like dirt. Jake started paying attention to Zara specifically. She worked alone, never speaking to anyone unless spoken to first. She ate her meals in empty corners away from the crowds. When other beings yelled at her or made fun of her, she would just nod and continue with her work. But sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, Jake could see something else in her expression. It was not just sadness or fear. There was intelligence there, and creativity, and a kind of quiet strength that reminded him of steel wrapped in silk. One afternoon, Jake was working on a water purification unit near the Waste Management Center. When he heard shouting, he looked up to see a group of young Vorthic surrounding Zara near the garbage sorting area. There were 5 of them, all bigger than her, all grinning with their sharp teeth showing. "Hey, Crystal Girl," one of them called out in broken Galactic Standard. "You missed a spot." They had dumped a container of rotten food scraps all over the floor she had just finished cleaning. The mess spread across the metal plates, filling the air with a sour smell. Zara looked at the mess, then at the Vorthic, then back at the mess. Without a word, she knelt down and started cleaning it up. "That's not good enough," another Vorthic said. He kicked some of the garbage toward her, splattering her with sticky liquid. "You need to be more careful." The others laughed and started kicking more garbage around, making the mess bigger and bigger. Zara kept cleaning, moving methodically, trying to stay calm. But Jake could see her hands shaking. That was when one of the Vorthic pulled out a small container from his belt. Jake recognized it immediately. It was concentrated acid, the kind they used to clean metal surfaces. It could burn through skin in seconds. "Let's see how well you clean when you can't see," the Vorthic said, raising the container toward Zara's face. Jake was moving before he realized it, his feet carrying him toward the group. Pete's warnings echoed in his head, but they seemed far away and unimportant. All he could see was a small, defenseless being about to be horribly hurt by creatures who thought it was funny. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying across the maintenance bay. "Leave her alone." The Vorthic turned to look at him, their reptilian faces showing surprise and then amusement. A human was telling them what to do. This was going to be entertaining. Jake stopped a few feet away from the group, his heart pounding. He was not particularly big or strong, and he definitely was not trained for fighting. But sometimes, he thought, you had to stand up for what was right, even if you were scared, especially if you were scared. "This is not your business, human," the lead Vorthic said, his voice like gravel in a blender. "Go back to your pipes and wires." "I'm making it my business," Jake replied. Surprised by how steady his voice sounded, the Vorthek with the acid container smiled, showing rows of yellow teeth. You want to take her place? We can arrange that. Jake felt his mouth go dry, but he nodded. If that's what it takes. For a moment, nobody moved. The maintenance bay was completely quiet except for the humming of machinery. Zara looked up from the garbage she was cleaning, her large eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been hope. Jake spent the next hour on his hands and knees, cleaning garbage with Zara while the Vorthek watched and laughed. They had found new ways to make the job harder, stepping in the mess with their boots and then walking around to spread it further. Every time Jake or Zara got close to finishing one area, the bullies would kick more trash around, but Jake did not complain. He worked steadily, sometimes glancing at Zara to make sure she was all right. She seemed shocked that anyone had helped her, and she kept looking at him like she expected him to disappear or change his mind. When the Vorthak finally got bored and left, Jake and Zara finished the cleaning in silence. As they put away the equipment, Zara spoke for the first time. Thank you, she said quietly. Her voice was soft and musical, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. You're welcome, Jake replied. I'm Jake, by the way. I am Zara. She paused, then added, Why did you help me? Humans do not usually help Keplerians. Jake thought about Pete's warnings and all the reasons he should have minded his own business. Because it was the right thing to do, he said finally. Zara stared at him for a long moment, then nodded and walked away without another word. Jake went back to his maintenance duties, but he could not stop thinking about what had happened. Pete was going to be furious when he found out, and Jake was pretty sure the Vorthek were not done with him yet. But every time he remembered the look of hopeless fear on Zara's face when they threatened her with acid, he knew he had made the right choice. He was right about Pete being angry. Are you completely insane? Pete shouted when he heard the story from another worker. They were in the human quarters, a cramped section of the station where all the human workers lived in tiny rooms barely big enough for a bed and a storage unit. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I helped someone who needed help, Jake said calmly. You interfered in alien business. Pete paced back and forth in the narrow space between their bunks. The Vorthek are going to report this to their superiors. They're going to say that humans are getting uppity and forgetting their place. And then guess what happens to all of us? Jake had heard this argument before. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Survive by being invisible? It was how humans had managed to find places on stations across the galaxy by being useful and quiet and never ever challenging the system. Maybe it's time someone challenged the system, Jake said. Pete stopped pacing and stared at him. You really are new, aren't you? Let me tell you what happens when species challenge the system. 3 years ago, the Kelmorians on Outpost 7 decided they deserved better working conditions. They organized a protest, very peaceful, very reasonable. You know what happened? The hegemony classified them as a disruptive element and banned them from working on any station in this sector. Half of them starve. Jake felt a chill run down his spine, but he tried not to show it. So we just let bullies hurt innocent people? We survive, Pete said firmly. That's what we do. We keep our heads down, do our jobs, and survive. And if you keep pulling stunts like today, we might not even be able to do that. That night, Jake lay in his narrow bunk and stared at the metal ceiling. He could hear Pete snoring in the next bed and the constant hum of the station's life support systems. Through the thin walls, he could hear other human families talking quietly in their rooms, always keeping their voices low so they would not disturb anyone important. It was a careful, quiet existence. A scared existence. The next morning, Jake was checking the water recyclers when he saw Zara again. She was working in the same area, but something was wrong. She moved more slowly than usual, and when she reached up to adjust a valve, Jake saw dark bruises on her arms. He waited until she was alone, then approached her carefully. Are you okay? He asked. Zara glanced around nervously before answering. The Vorthek came to my quarters last night. They said I had embarrassed them by accepting help from a human. They wanted to make sure I understood my place. Jake felt anger building in his chest like a fire. They hurt you. It could have been worse, Zara said quietly. They could have used the acid. This is insane, Jake muttered. We need to report. This, Zara looked at him with surprise. Report it to who? Station security? They are all hegemony species. They do not care what happens to Keplerians. Sometimes they are the ones doing the hurting. Jake realized she was right. The entire system was set up to protect the powerful and ignore the weak. There was no higher authority to appeal to because the higher authorities were the ones who made the rules in the first place. There has to be something we can do, he said. There is, Zara replied. We can stay quiet and hope they get bored with us. But Jake could see in her eyes that she did not really believe things would get better. She had the look of someone who had given up hope a long time ago. Over the next few days, Jake tried to keep an eye on Zara without being obvious about it. He saw the Vorthak youngsters bothering her again, but they were more careful now. They would wait until no humans were around, then push her or trip her or make her clean up messes they had made on purpose. Jake also noticed other things. He saw how the food vendors would shortchange Keplerians, giving them smaller portions for the same price. He watched security guards ignore crimes against lower-tier species, while coming down hard on any violation by those same species. He observed how the medical bay would treat humans and other lesser beings only for the most serious injuries, making them wait hours for basic care. The whole station was built on a foundation of cruelty, and everyone just accepted it as normal. On the fourth day after the first incident, everything changed. Jake was working on a malfunctioning air filter when he heard Pete calling his name over the communication system. His supervisor's voice sounded different, strained, and worried. Jake, get to Maintenance Bay 7 immediately. There's a situation. Jake dropped his tools and ran through the corridors, his heart pounding. Maintenance Bay 7 was where the most dangerous repair work was done, where they handled toxic chemicals and radioactive materials. As he got closer, he could hear shouting. When he arrived, he found a crowd gathered around the entrance to the sealed contamination chamber. Pete was there, along with several other human workers. Dr. Lisa Park, the station's human medic, was arguing with someone Jake could not see through the crowd. She'd die in there without proper protection, Dr. Park was saying, her voice tight with anger. The radiation levels are off the charts? That is not your concern, human, came a deep, harsh voice that Jake recognized. Commander Zereth, one of the highest-ranking hegemony officers on the station. The Keplerian will clean the contaminated materials as ordered, or she will be punished for refusing to work. Jake pushed through the crowd and saw the situation clearly. Zara stood at the entrance to the contamination chamber, holding a basic cleaning kit that would offer no protection against the deadly radiation inside. The chamber glowed with an eerie green light, and warning signs in multiple languages covered every surface. Commander Zereth was enormous, even for his species. His armored skin was dark gray, and his forearms ended in claws that could tear through metal. His eyes were small and mean, and when he looked at the gathered humans, his expression showed nothing but contempt. This is a punishment for inefficiency, Zereth announced to the crowd. The Keplerian has been too slow in her duties. She will clean the contaminated reactor core, and perhaps other lower-tier species will learn to work faster. Sir, Dr. Park tried again, the radiation will kill her within minutes. This isn't punishment, it's execution. Your opinion is not requested, human, Zereth replied coldly. Return to your duties before I decide you also need to learn about efficiency. Jake looked at Zara's face and saw that she understood exactly what was happening. This was not really about her work performance. This was about the Vorthak reporting that she had received help from a human, and Commander Zereth deciding to make an example that would keep both species in line. She was going to die because Jake had tried to help her. The thought hit him like a punch to the stomach. His attempt to do the right thing had made everything worse. Now Zara would suffer for his actions, and there was nothing he could do about it, or was there? Jake found himself stepping forward before he had consciously decided to move. Commander, he said, his voice somehow steady despite the fear coursing through his body. "I volunteer to take her place." The crowd went completely silent. Even the constant background noise of the station seemed to fade away. Commander Zereth turned his cold gaze on Jake, and for a moment nobody breathed. "You volunteer," Zereth said slowly, as if testing the words. "A human volunteers to enter a contaminated chamber to save a Keplerian." "Yes, sir," Jake replied. Pete grabbed his arm and whispered urgently, "What are you doing? You'll die in there." Jake looked at Zara, who was staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. Then he looked back at Commander Zereth. "Humans are replaceable," Jake said, using the system's own logic against it. "Keplerians have specialized knowledge of waste processing that takes years to develop. From an efficiency standpoint, it makes more sense to risk a human." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that the hegemony's cold logic might accept. Commander Zereth studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The inside of the contamination chamber was like stepping into a nightmare. Green light pulsed from the walls, and Jake's radiation detector immediately started beeping rapidly. The sound grew faster and louder with each step he took toward the damaged reactor core. Jake had volunteered for this without really thinking about what it meant. Now, surrounded by deadly radiation, he understood exactly how he was going to die. The invisible energy would cook him from the inside out, destroying his cells one by one until his body simply stopped working. But he had work to do first. The cleaning equipment was basic but functional. Jake pulled on the thin protective suit. That would buy him a few extra minutes at best. Then started collecting the radioactive debris scattered around the reactor core. Each piece he picked up made his detector scream louder. Through the thick glass window of the chamber, he could see the crowd still watching. Commander Zereth stood with his arms crossed, waiting for the show to begin. Pete looked sick, and Dr. Park was preparing medical equipment she probably knew would be useless, and Zara was pressed against the window, her blue hands flat against the glass, watching every move he made. Jake worked steadily, trying not to think about the burning sensation that was starting to spread through his body. The radiation was already doing its damage, but he focused on the task. If he was going to die anyway, he would at least finish the job properly. It took him 20 minutes to collect all the contaminated materials and seal them in the disposal containers. By the time he was done, his detector was screaming constantly, and his vision was starting to blur. When he finally stumbled out of the chamber, his legs gave out and he collapsed on the floor. Dr. Park was beside him immediately, scanning him with her medical equipment. Her face went pale when she saw the readings. "Get him to the medical bay," she ordered. Now, as they carried Jake through the corridors, he heard Commander Zereth speaking to the crowd. "Let this be a lesson," the hegemony officer announced. "This is what happens when lower species forget their place. The human chose to die for nothing. Remember this when you think about disobeying orders." But Jake noticed something in the crowd that Commander Zereth did not see. The other species were not just watching with fear or indifference like usual. Some of them looked troubled. A few even looked angry. Dr. Park worked on Jake for 3 days straight, using every piece of medical equipment she could get her hands on. She gave him drugs to fight the radiation sickness and treatments to help his body repair the damage. She barely slept, checking on him every few hours. "Why did you do it?" she asked him on the second day when he was awake enough to talk. "You had to know it was probably suicide." Jake's throat was raw and it hurt to speak. "Someone had to," he whispered. "But why you? Why risk everything for a Keplerian girl you barely know?" Jake thought about that for a while. "Because," he said finally, "if we only help people who look like us or think like us, then we're not really human anymore. We're just another species, looking out for ourselves." Dr. Park stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the stupidest." "Probably both," Jake admitted. On the 4th day, Jake was finally strong enough to sit up in bed. Dr. Park said he would live, though the radiation exposure had done permanent damage that would affect him for the rest of his life. He was lucky. To be alive at all, that afternoon, Zara came to visit him. She brought food with her. Simple rations that she had saved from her own meals. It was not much, but Jake knew it meant she had been eating less so she could share with him. "You did not have to do this," she said, sitting in the chair next to his bed. "Yes, I did," Jake replied. "But why? In 3 years on this station, no one has ever helped me. Most beings act like I do not exist. The rest treat me like something disgusting they want to get rid of. Why would a human risk his life for me?" Jake looked at her carefully. Her blue skin still glowed softly, and her large eyes held an intelligence that the station's hierarchy ignored completely. "Tell me about your people," he said instead of answering directly. Zara seemed surprised by the question. "My people? We were artists, mostly. Poets and musicians and sculptors. Our cities were made of living crystal that sang in harmony with the wind. We created beauty because we believed beauty made life worth living. What happened to all of that? The hegemony found our world and decided the crystals could be mined for industrial use. They said art was a waste of resources. They took our cities apart piece by piece and scattered my people across the galaxy as workers." Her voice grew quiet. "Most Keplerians have forgotten the old ways. They say there is no point in remembering beauty when your life is spent cleaning garbage." "But you remember," Jake said. Zara nodded. "I remember some of the songs. Some of the poems. I keep them alive in my mind because I think if we forget everything we used to be, then we really are just what they say we are. Would you share one with me?" Zara looked around nervously, then leaned closer to Jake's bed. In a voice barely above a whisper, she began to recite something in her own language. Jake could not understand the words, but the rhythm and melody were beautiful. It sounded like water flowing over stones, or wind moving through trees. When she finished, she translated it into Galactic Standard. "It means the stars remember what we forget, and in their light we find our way home." Jake felt tears in his eyes. "That's beautiful." "It is forbidden to speak Keplerian on the station," Zara said. "If security heard me, I would be punished for maintaining cultural resistance." "Then we'll make sure they don't hear you," said a voice from the doorway. They both turned to see Pete standing there with Carl Thompson, one of the human cargo handlers. Carl was a big man with rough hands and a face that had seen too many fights. Jake had never spoken to him much, but Pete had brought him here for a reason. "Carl heard about what you did," Pete said. "He wanted to meet you." Carl stepped forward and looked down at Jake with serious eyes. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the dumbest," he said. "But either way, it was the right thing to do." "I thought you'd be angry," Jake said, like Pete was. "Oh, I was angry," Carl replied. "Angry that it took a kid from Earth to show the rest of us what we should have been doing all along." He looked at Zara. "I'm sorry, miss. Sorry we never helped before." Pete shifted uncomfortably. "Carl thinks we should organize some of the humans. Start looking out for each other better, and maybe for some of the other species too." "That's dangerous," Jake pointed out. "So is living like cowards," Carl said bluntly. "You showed us that much." Over the next few days, more humans came to visit Jake. Dr. Park was there constantly, checking his recovery. Melody Chun, a young communications officer, brought him books to read. Even some of the maintenance workers he barely knew stopped by to see how he was doing, but it was not just humans. One evening, an elderly Etherian appeared in the medical bay. He was tall and thin, with pale skin that seemed to glow from within. Most Etherians ignored humans completely, considering them too primitive to be worth noticing. "I am Kex," the Etherian said in his musical voice. "I have come to speak with the human who entered the contamination chamber." "That's me," Jake said, unsure what to expect. Kex studied him with large, silver eyes. "Why did you do it?" Jake was getting tired of that question, but he tried to answer honestly. "Because it was wrong to let her die for something that wasn't her fault." "And what do you think your actions accomplished?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe I just made things worse." "Perhaps," Keck said. "Or perhaps you reminded us that there are different ways to live." He paused, then added, "My people pride ourselves on wisdom, but we have been wise in ways that ignore suffering. That is not true wisdom at all." "What are you saying?" "I am saying that an old Etherean has learned something from a young human, and that is a gift I had not expected to receive." After Kex left, Zara looked at Jake with wonder. "An Etherean spoke to you as an equal. I have never seen that happen with a human before." "Things are changing," Jake said, though he was not sure if that was true or just hope talking. The real test came a week later, when Jake was finally allowed to return to work. Commander Zereth had made it clear that the human survival changed nothing about the station's hierarchy. If anything, he seemed more determined to make an example of anyone who stepped out of line. Jake was working on a water filtration unit when he heard shouting from the cargo bay. He recognized the voices immediately, more Vorthak bullies, and they had found a new target. When Jake arrived, he saw 3 Vorthaks surrounding a young Chitauri worker. The insect-like being was on the ground, green blood flowing from cuts on his arms where the Vorthak had slashed him with their claws. "Please," the Chitauri was saying, "I did not mean to bump into you. It was an accident." "Accidents have consequences." One of the Vorthak growled, raising his clawed hand for another strike. Jake stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Leave him alone." The Vorthak turned to look at him, and Jake saw recognition in their reptilian eyes. These were the same ones who had tormented Zara. "The hero human," the leader hissed. "Come to save another worthless creature? Come to stop bullies from hurting people who can't fight back," Jake replied. The Vorthak laughed and started moving toward Jake. Word of what happened in the cargo bay spread through the station like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew that humans, Etherians, and Keplerians had stood together to protect a Chitauri worker. Some beings were angry about it. Others were confused. But many were talking about it in quiet voices when they thought no one was listening. Commander Zereth was furious. Jake was in the maintenance bay when the hegemony officer arrived with a squad of armed guards. The massive alien's gray skin was darker than usual, which Jake had learned meant he was in a rage. "Human," Zereth said, his voice like grinding stone. "You have been causing trouble." "I've been doing my job, sir," Jake replied, not looking up from the air recycler he was repairing. "Your job does not include organizing lower species into groups." "I wasn't organizing anything, I was just standing in a cargo bay." Zereth stepped closer, and Jake could smell the metallic scent of his breath. "Do not play games with me, human. You think your little display yesterday means something? You think the system will change because a few worthless creatures stood together?" Jake finally looked up. "I think bullies don't like it when people stand up to them." For a moment, Jake thought Zereth was going to kill him right there. The commanders. 4 hands clenched into fists, and his small eyes burned with hatred. But then he seemed to get control of himself. "Very well," Zereth said slowly. "You want to be a leader? You want to protect the weak? Let us see how far you are willing to go." He gestured to his guards, and they grabbed Jake by the arms. "You are charged with inciting disorder among station personnel," Zereth announced. "You and your co-conspirators will be executed tomorrow morning as an example to others who might think about disrupting station operations." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. "Co-conspirators?" "The Keplerian girl who started this. The Etherian who joined your little group. The humans who followed you, all of them." Zereth smiled his cold smile. "You wanted to save others, human. Now you have condemned them to die with you." The guards dragged Jake through the corridors toward the detention center. As they passed other workers, Jake saw faces he recognized looking back at him with fear and worry. Pete was there, his face white with shock. Dr. Park started to follow them, but was warned off by another guard. The detention center was a series of small metal cells in the lowest level of the station. Jake was thrown into one that already contained Zara, Kex, and Carl. They had been arrested shortly after Jake. "I'm sorry," Jake said as soon as the guards left. "This is my fault. I dragged all of you into this." "No one dragged me anywhere," Carl said firmly. "I made my own choice." "As did I," Kex added. His usual calm was gone, replaced by something that looked like anger. I have lived for 200 years, and I have spent most of that time being wise and careful and completely useless. If I die tomorrow, at least I will die having done something worthwhile. Zara was sitting in the corner, her blue glow dimmed to almost nothing. They are going to execute us in front of everyone, she said quietly, to make sure the others know. What happens when you step out of line? Jake slumped against the wall. His attempt to help had made everything worse. Now, instead of just Zara being hurt, he had gotten innocent people killed. I should never have interfered, he said. I should have listened to Pete and minded my own business. And let me die in the contamination chamber? Zara asked. Better one death than four. Zara stood up and walked over to him. Her glow was still dim, but her eyes were bright with determination. Do you know what my people believed? She asked. We believed that every act of beauty made the universe a little better. Every song, every poem, every sculpture added something good to existence. But we also believed that every act of kindness did the same thing. What's your point? My point is that you added something good to the universe when you helped me. And when the others helped that Chitauri boy yesterday, they added something good too. Even if we die tomorrow, that goodness doesn't disappear. It becomes part of what exists. Kex nodded slowly. The young Keplerian speaks wisdom that my people claim to possess but rarely practice. Pretty words, Carl said, but we're still going to be dead tomorrow. That night, none of them slept much. They talked about their lives, their hopes, the things they wished they had done differently. Jake learned that Carl had a family on a mining colony that he sent most of his wages to. Kex had been a teacher before coming to the station, trying to share Etherian knowledge with other species. Zara had dreamed of becoming an engineer before her world was destroyed. They were just ordinary people who had tried to do something right that morning. Came too soon. The guards arrived to escort them to the execution platform, which had been set up in the main plaza where everyone on the station would be able to see it. As they walked through the corridors, Jake noticed that they seemed unusually empty. Most beings were probably already at the plaza, waiting for the show to begin, but when they reached the main plaza, Jake stopped in shock. The execution platform was there, surrounded by hegemony guards. Commander Zereth stood on a raised dais, ready to make his speech about the consequences of disobedience, but the plaza was not just full of spectators. It was packed with beings from every level of the station's hierarchy, and they were not all there just to watch. Humans stood in neat rows near the front, at least 200 of them. Jake saw Pete there, and Dr. Park, and Melody Chun, and dozens of others he recognized from the human quarters. But there were also humans he had never seen before, people who had come out of hiding for this moment. Behind the humans stood a group of Keplerians, more than Jake had ever seen together in one place. Their blue skin glowed softly in the artificial light, and they stood with a dignity that the station's hierarchy had tried to steal from them. The Etherians were there too, their tall forms floating slightly above the ground as they hovered in perfect formation. Even some of the younger Chitauri and Vorthak had joined the crowd. Standing apart from their elders but clearly present, Commander Zereth looked out at the assembled crowd and his expression darkened. What is the meaning of this gathering? Captain. Alex Rodriguez, the senior human officer on the station, stepped forward. Jake had met him only once when he first arrived. Rodriguez was a careful man who usually avoided confrontation with the higher-tier species. We are here to witness the proceedings, as permitted under coalition law, Rodriguez said formally. This is not a trial, Zereth replied. This is an execution of criminals who disrupted station operations. Then we are here to witness the execution, Rodriguez said calmly. Zereth looked around at the hundreds of beings surrounding the platform. Jake could see the commander calculating odds, trying to figure out what this crowd meant for his authority. Very well, Zereth said finally. Witness the fate of those who forget their place. He gestured to the guards who pushed Jake and his friends onto the platform. The crowd was completely silent, but Jake could feel their attention like a physical. Wait, these criminals, Zereth announced, his voice carrying across the plaza, violated the natural order that keeps our station functioning. They organized resistance to lawful authority. They encourage disobedience among lower-tier species. For these crimes, they will be executed as an example to others. The crowd remained silent, but Jake noticed something. They were not just watching passively. They were standing together, species that normally avoided each other, united in something that looked like purpose. Xerath raised his hand to signal the guards to begin the execution. But before he could give the order, Captain Rodriguez spoke again. "Commander, I must formally protest this action under Coalition Regulation 47C. Xerath lowered his hand, looking annoyed. "What regulation?" "The right of member species to protect their own personnel from unlawful execution. These humans are under the protection of Earth's colonial administration. They are criminals. They have not been tried by any legitimate court. They have been condemned by a single officer for actions that do not clearly violate any written law." Jake saw Xerath's jaw clench. The commander was being challenged on legal grounds in front of hundreds of witnesses. If he proceeded with the execution now, he would be breaking coalition law himself. "The Etherian and the Keplerian are not under human protection," Xerath said. "Actually," said a new voice, "they are under ours." An elderly Etherian that Jake had never seen before glided into the plaza. Behind him came a dozen more Etherians, all wearing the silver robes that marked them as members of their species. "Ruling Council. I am Siren, speaker for the Etherian Collective," the newcomer announced. "We formally claim protection over the being known as Kex under our ancient right of species solidarity." Another voice joined in. "And we claim protection over Zara under the same right." Jake turned to see a group of Keplerians he did not recognize walking into the plaza. They moved with more confidence than any Keplerians he had seen on the station, and their skin glowed brighter than usual. "Who are you?" Xerath demanded. "We are the Keplerian Cultural Preservation Society," their leader replied. "We represent Keplerians throughout this sector who still remember what we were before we became servants. And we claim the ancient right to protect our people from unlawful execution." The plaza was now completely silent. Jake could see Commander Xerath looking around at the crowd. The legal review that Commander Xerath had promised never came. Instead, Jake and his friends sat in their cell for 3 days while lawyers from the coalition government argued over subspace communications. The hegemony wanted the executions to proceed. Earth's colonial administration demanded a fair trial. The Etherian Collective threatened to withdraw from several trade agreements. Even some Keplerian worlds that had been silent for decades began sending formal protests. What had started as a simple disciplinary action on a remote station had become a galaxy-wide political incident. On the 4th day, the cell door opened, and Captain Rodriguez walked in with a coalition official Jake had never seen before. "You're free to go," Rodriguez said simply. Jake could hardly believe it. What happened? "The Coalition Council reviewed the case and found that no actual laws were broken," the official explained. "Standing in a cargo bay is not a crime. Helping injured workers is not a crime. Organizing peaceful gatherings is protected under coalition law." "What about Commander Xerath?" Rodriguez smiled grimly. "The commander has been reassigned to a desk job on a supply depot in the Outer Rim. The coalition decided that an officer who tries to execute people for non-crimes might not be the best choice for running a major trade station." As they walked out of the detention center, Jake saw that new Centauri station looked different than it had a week ago. Beings from different species were talking to each other openly in the corridors. The maintenance areas where Jake worked now had mixed crews of humans, Keplerians and even some Etherians working side by side. The hierarchy was still there, but it felt less rigid somehow. Less absolute. Dr. Park was waiting for them in the medical bay, where she gave them all thorough checkups to make sure their time in detention had not hurt their health. When she finished with Jake, she pulled him aside. "There's something you should know," she said. "That young Shatari you helped in the cargo bay. His name is KLK, and he's been asking about you every day. He wants to thank you properly." "He doesn't need to thank me for anything." "Maybe not, but he wants to anyway. And Jake, he's not the only one. There are dozens of beings on this station who want to meet the human who stood up to the bullies." Over the next few weeks, Jake discovered what Dr. Park meant. Everywhere he went, beings would approach him to share their stories. A young Vorthak told him about being picked on by older members of his species for being too small. An elderly Chitauri described how she had been cheated by merchants for years because she was afraid to complain. Even some Etherians admitted that they had stayed silent when they should have spoken up. But the most important visitor came 3 weeks after their release. Jake was working on a water purification unit when Zara found him. She looked different than she had before. Her blue skin glowed brighter, and she held herself with more confidence. "I have news," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "Good news, I hope. The Coalition has approved a new program. They are going to create mixed-species engineering teams on stations throughout this sector. And they want me to help design the training curriculum." Jake stopped working and stared at her. "They want you to be a teacher? More than that. They want me to be an engineer. A real engineer, not just someone who cleans up after other people's work." Her glow brightened even more. "And Jake, they want you to be part of the program too. They said they need humans who understand how to work with other species. I don't understand. Why would they want me? Because you showed them something they had forgotten. That different species can work together if they treat each other with respect." The new program started 2 months later. Jake found himself in a classroom with beings from a dozen different species, all learning to work together on complex engineering projects. Zara was one of the instructors teaching courses on integrated systems design. Her knowledge of both Keplerian crystal technology and standard coalition engineering made her incredibly valuable. Carl became a crew chief for one of the mixed species maintenance teams. Pete, who had initially been angry about Jake's interference, volunteered to help train new human workers in what he called proper station diplomacy. Even Kex was given a position developing educational programs for young beings from different species, but the real changes were smaller and more personal. Jake was walking through the station's main plaza when he saw a group of young beings from different species playing together. Human children were learning Etherian math games while Keplerian youngsters taught them traditional songs. A young Vorthak was showing the others how to make sculptures from recycled metal, his natural strength. Carefully controlled to avoid hurting his smaller friends. 6 months ago, such a scene would have been impossible. Different species did not mix socially, and they certainly did not let their children play together. Now it was becoming normal. Jake continued through the plaza and found himself at the memorial wall where the station honored beings who had died in service. There was a new plaque there, installed just the week before. It read, "In memory of those who stood up for others and in honor of those who stand up still." "It's beautiful, isn't it?" said a familiar voice behind him. Jake turned to see Zara approaching, carrying a small crystal sculpture that glowed with soft blue light. "What's that?" he asked. "Something I made for you." "It's a traditional Keplerian friendship gift." She handed him the sculpture, and he could feel warmth radiating from it. "It will glow brighter when you're near people who care about you." As soon as Jake took the crystal, it began to shine more brilliantly. He looked around and saw Carl walking by with his mixed-species work crew, all of them laughing at something one of the Etherians had said. Dr. Park was at her medical station, treating a Chitauri child while the child's parents watched gratefully. Melody Chung was at a communications console, helping a Keplerian family contact relatives on another station. All around them, beings who had once been enemies were working together, learning from each other, building something better than what had existed before. "How did this happen?" Jake asked, still amazed by the transformation. "You know how," Zara replied. "One person decided to stand up. Then another person decided to join them. Then another and another. Change doesn't happen all at once, Jake. It happens one choice at a time." Jake looked at the crystal in his hands, then at the busy plaza full of beings who were learning to see past their differences. "Do you think it will last?" he asked. "I think it will grow," Zara said. "There are other stations where beings are hearing about what happened here." Some of them are starting their own mixed species programs. Others are questioning their own hierarchies, and some are probably getting angry about it. Yes, that too. Change is never easy, and there will always be those who prefer the old ways. But Jake, do you see those children playing together? Jake looked at the group of young beings who were now building something together with blocks and metal pieces, each species contributing their own skills to the project. They're going to grow up thinking this is normal, Zara continued. They're going to expect different species to work together and treat each other fairly. And when they become adults, they're going to build a galaxy that's better than the one we inherited? Jake nodded, understanding what she meant. The galaxy had not changed overnight. There were still stations where the old hierarchies ruled absolutely. There were still species who hated and feared each other. There were still bullies who used their power to hurt those weaker than themselves, but there were also places like New Centauri Station where beings were learning that they had more in common than they had differences. There were mixed species crews working together on projects that no single species could accomplish alone. There were children growing up without the prejudices their parents had been taught. It was not perfect. It might never be perfect. But it was better, and it was getting better still. That evening, Jake was in his quarters reading when he heard singing from the corridor outside. He opened his door and saw a small group of beings walking past, humans and Keplerians and Etherians together, harmonizing in a song that blended melodies from all their cultures. Jake smiled and closed his door. Tomorrow he would go back to work on engineering projects that were beyond anything he could have imagined when he first arrived on the station. He would work alongside beings who had once been considered his inferiors or his superiors, but who were now simply his colleagues and friends. The crystal Zara had given him sat on his desk, glowing softly in the darkness. It would glow brighter tomorrow when he saw his friends again, and brighter still as more beings learned to see past the artificial barriers that had divided them for so long. Change, Jake had learned, was not about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about ordinary people deciding to do what was right even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous, even when they were afraid. It was about standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. It was about refusing to accept that cruelty was just the way things had to be, and sometimes, if you were very lucky and very persistent, it was about discovering that you were not standing alone after all. The galaxy was full of beings who were waiting for someone to take the first step. Jake had taken that step when he helped Zara in a maintenance bay. Others had followed.